In the previous video, we discussed the concept of al-kitab, touching on the historical, sociological, and metaphysical dimensions, but leaving implicit a precondition that could only be discussed at length. Our catalog of videos is rife with this word. We figured we'd prioritize those concepts in which the concept of knowledge, Quranically defined, factors as an essential component before we turned our attention to those tools used to define those major concepts. In most systems, the reverse usually takes place, but this is because those systems are not as intuitive as the Quran, where the concepts we come across presuppose their tools, and the tools anticipate the concepts in which their best use is to be placed. Once an idea in the Quran is grasped, it becomes a matter of separating and distinguishing the role of those things that comprise the whole intellectual complex. That is to say, most of the intellectual work begins when the understanding has taken place. Because to fully understand that which we often think we've understood, we must understand the conditions by which to understand, and by means of which to successfully reproduce it. This is a commonplace in scientific epistemology. This is because it is in reproduction that understanding and, by extension, knowledge is proven, in reintroducing the concept, in the precise constructive steps in which it's first introduced, as well as in conditions other than those in which we first accidentally applied or encountered them. Knowledge thus is proven in application. This, of course, occurs in degrees, from those faculties over which we have no control, and gradually to those over which we have absolute control. We call those that lay on the least control side of the spectrum impressions. Under them fall things like sensations, perceptions, memories, etc. And although those require and presuppose complex mental faculties to even receive and recognize them, we see that they take little to no effort. They just pop up. On the opposite side of the spectrum lay data that require and presuppose more or less intellectual exercise and mental effort to access and represent them. Think pure mathematics, quantum mechanics, analytic geometry, or Hegel. Those are fields of knowledge whose access requires construction or reason. Not only are they extrasensory and leagues below what our sensations are accustomed to showing, but so often are the tools needed to access them. We can't begin to approach or read quantum mechanical phenomena without concepts like electrons, photons, force fields, etc., or physics in general without mass, gravity, space-time that are their tools. Science is generally defined by the degree to which our mental exercise removes us from the sensory world, and how much intellectual effort is needed. The higher we ascend, the sharper and more refined our tools need to be. In fact, so often, we don't know the difference between the tools and the concepts of which they are tools. And it's actually a good thing because, as Bradley found, and if I may add, the hard way, and I'm here referring to Bradley's regress problem, we cannot, without losing our sense of reality, effect any sharp separation between the two, and that a tautological approach, as Einstein shows, of relativity is our best approach. Though this requires special extension. Here, neither are concepts only conceptual, nor their instruments only instrumental, but both, depending on our approach, and what our conditions/circumstances make necessary. Evidence of this need not be provided, as we already see how massive a change this seemingly simple consideration effected in the course of science, and consequently history. Namely, how revolutionary the inductive method of modern science proved to be. Arnold J. Toynbee deplored what he called the industrialization of historical thought, and pathological extremes to which an emphasis on applied and material sciences can incline. But this is merely a consequence of the limitless world which this change in approach has ushered in the field of knowledge. The expansion in the inner space of our intuition to involve configurations of space beyond what we call the classical, namely Euclidean space, and expansion in actual space through colonial rule and resource mining are synonymous. The turn towards the empirical and applied sciences away from the humanities, philology, and history, whose depreciation by comparison proved inversely proportional, cannot entirely be pinned on the economic shifts of the time, but could plausibly be said to be an implication of the search for a field in which our faculties could be allowed to roam free and unhinged. We can't exactly say the same on the humanities side of things, where it's easy for ideas to become controversial and stifled, and for new ideas to die before they're even born. In nature, we can expect no restrictions of the sort. Rather, the only restriction we have to worry about is purely intellectual, which is exactly what we want. Do we have the appropriate tools by which to access this or that field of phenomena? Are the facts we're searching after accessible by today's methods? Or is their access a matter of sharpening those we're already in possession of? If they are not to be accessed by tomorrow's methods, then we can predict a priori in what way tomorrow's methods may be superior to today's, that its ideas are more distinguished and refined, the nuances which in today's method are lumped together indistinguishably, however inconsequential they may appear to us today, are tomorrow's monuments and cornerstones. It is to changes in method that every revolution of science is owed, not to an increase in data. This is very important in relation to the definition of knowledge in the Quran, for knowledge in the Quran is an expression of method, not an increase in the amount of information. Take the example of Solomon in verse 43 in Surah 27, where Solomon says, "And we were given knowledge from before, and we had been Muslims." The meaning of knowledge as epistemological is shown here. Solomon expresses this, for how else can such a vast concept be generalized in such a way as if to imply possessing the whole thing? Is this logical? Could one really possess knowledge of everything?
They ask you, O Prophet, about the Spirit. Say, its nature is known only to my Lord, and you, O humanity, have been given but little knowledge.
This verse here gives us a similar sense, for the Quran here speaks eternally, or subspecie eternitatis. It is not merely to the Prophet and contemporaries of the Quran's revelation that this verse applies, i.e. the littleness of knowledge, but also to those who came before and those thereafter. In other words, there will never be a time in which we'll know more than, as God put it, little knowledge. Once more, the term knowledge occurs with that instrumental sense.
Those gifted with knowledge clearly see that what has been revealed to you from your Lord, O Prophet, is the truth, and that it guides to the path of the Almighty, the praiseworthy.
It may be argued that the statement, "those who are given knowledge," points to the recipients of the previous revelation, adherents of the Torah and the Bible at the time of the Prophet, which is true. However, the concept of knowledge, or ilm, here is used in a much broader sense. It may be phrased this way: the holy books are not conveyors of knowledge or ilm, but are structures, the accessing of which requires knowledge or ilm. However, the very tools by which to access them are actually found in them. As paradoxical as this may sound, it actually is the case. The very tools are found in the text, inasmuch as the manual for putting together a piece of IKEA furniture or some machine is found in the package. And to activate the text, you must apply the tools with which the text was composed. And nowhere else are such tools available than in the very book. That is to say, understanding happens through reproduction. All we need to do is reach a certain level in the reading of the text, at which one begins to discern the relations between the ideas, where one concept is found to imply or presuppose another, where one could tell what propositions would be contradictory, and under what conditions we may consider a proposition adequate or true. Think of it by analogy to our senses. Within the bounds of the book, a deep enough immersion into the text will have furnished in you what is equivalent to sense organs. You have a direct, deeper, and peripheral vision. The ideas feel vivid, vague, or dense. You have a sense of their time, their endurance, frequency, or associations, a sense of form, a sense of similarity or difference, and commonalities, a sense of their potential, possibility, etc. This is nothing strange. We're already familiar with this from language learning, where the rules at first are felt like a law. But once fluency is reached, no longer feel as such, but feel rather orienting or informing. Because to understand the text, one must reproduce the same reasoning, the same thought process, the same mindset, the same understanding as went into the weaving of the material itself. Thus, what one obtains from the text is something epistemic, methodological, a certain way of thinking about and composing. And it's truly this that constitutes the idea of knowledge, in appropriately reproducing and reintroducing concepts into the situations in which they are demanded. This requires recognition, first of all, as to the nature of the situation, its form, and a general understanding of its foundations. But this recognition requires that one is acquainted with the form, with the elements of the situation, which requires intellection, a reading into, an analysis of the situation, a building of contextual knowledge. This understanding coincides with what Aristotle calls phronesis, practical knowledge.
Our Lord, raise from among them a messenger who will recite to them your revelations, teach them the book and wisdom, and purify them. Indeed, you alone are the Almighty, all-wise.
That the Quran is described here as Hekma is not the same as when it's described as Kitab, for the latter, as we saw in the last video, directly refers to the law-imparting, constructive aspect of the text, the specific architectonic and structural side of the Quran, i.e., the framework on which is then mapped what's called Hekma. The specific plan of the book, i.e., Kitab, necessarily brings with it the most quintessential motifs and lessons of history. And Hekma, by its very nature, searches for the most quintessential of lessons. Thus, the relation between Kitab and Hekma can easily be seen. What's more, it mirrors what we said regarding the relation between the tools and their best use. The Kitab acquaints us with the mechanics of the law, and Hekma shows us examples of their application. What's implied here is that to every instance of the Kitab, there's an equivalent in Hekma, that they are directly proportional to one another. But more than this, that ilm specifically pertains to this relation here. How can we recognize in certain situations the best course of action? As the example of the man of knowledge, i.e. Moses' mentor, demonstrates. Is it not knowledge of how things generally play out, i.e. a certain prescience and foreknowledge of how things go on? If we can accurately predict how things play out, we have immediate recourse to the best way to conduct a situation. Hekma generally covers the sphere of possible action, of decision, of application, of contextual knowledge, and the Kitab the timeless, the ontological, the eternal, and thus the former accrues from the latter, and the latter foregrounds the former. But no relation between them is discernible without ilm. Not only is ilm the ability to know this, but it's also the means by which to act in certain situations according to general principles derived from the Kitab. Or in the Kantian phrase,
Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. The categorical imperative.
Only the difference here is that the categorical imperative rests upon the Kitab. Such an application, inconsistency with the notion that knowledge is proven only in application, consummates and gives us the notion of Hekma. The meaning that Hekma is epistemological can be seen here. It is the reverse. to the commonly held notion that knowledge equals amount of information one possesses, and whether one scores high in some quiz that contains questions like, when was the Eiffel Tower built, or who invented the typewriter? The case is opposite. It's something like being able to calculate the fuel cost for a road trip. Here, some knowledge of mathematics is required, and it's a skill, the possession of which allows me to apply it in any sphere and handle various problems. This is knowledge or ilm. It is a craft, a techne, or technique, that one is able to apply when the situation necessitates. It is said here that God is teaching him, not for the fact of what God was teaching Joseph, but that he was teaching him. For what it means is that Joseph was being imparted upon a certain craft or skill, something he could apply given the situation. For him, this knowledge was the interpretation of speech, to analyze and deconstruct the symbolic, something which enabled him to interpret the king's dream and help steer the kingdom away from economic ruin. This is the same thing that Solomon was referring to when he said that we were given knowledge, with a definite article, al-ilm, the knowledge. For in this context, it would have been interpreted not as the knowledge that made it possible to specifically conjure up the queen's throne, but rather the faculty that allows him to perform such feats in the first place. The same thing we mean when we use the phrase scientific knowledge, for it's often used with this inclusive sense of being able to make a lot of things and solve a wide variety of problems. In the verses mention the term ni'mah. Ni'mah is the complement of ilm, the expression of ilm as an endowment, or something that's beneficial to its wielder, something bountiful to its user, serving as an instrument in their hand, a certain craft that accompanies him throughout his life and helps him solve crucial problems. In short, a gift. And this is the sense of gift that we use when we call someone who's exceptional as something gifted. Like Solomon in verse 19 of The Ant, where he expresses gratitude with respect to this faculty which God had endowed him with, being able to understand animal speech. He uses the word ni'mah specifically. Note the synthetic role of knowledge as such, al-ilm, in bridging the gap between having and doing, between possession and aptitude, between faculty and facility. It is actually the thing that allows us to draw the line between man and animal, and in turn between animal and the inanimate. For even there, sentience and some ability to apply oneself and to be distinguished as that which does some definite thing is an expression of this faculty. But in human beings, this faculty is markedly distinguished, namely in its scale. We're not confined in this respect. By will or whim, we can develop a certain faculty to learn some craft, build a business or industry, or a society around it, which an animal would never think to learn. But interestingly, even as we think about the cognitive limitations of animals, the limiting factor is not incapacity, but inopportunity. Animals have as much of this faculty as falls to their share. They probably see as much value in being exposed to ours as we see in being restricted to theirs. Ilm, as defined in the Quran, is thus to be taken in a much broader sense, first considering the epistemological dimension of the concept, that it's methodic, not encyclopedic, and then considering the context of use. This way we effectively embody the concept in the act of explaining it. In regards to the Quran, and specifically the type of ilm, or knowledge that's required to access it, to appropriately understand and assimilate the book, the same method is reflected in the steps just given. For this itself, the outlining of the conditions of knowledge happens to be the same method by which to understand the meaning of any Quranic proposition. That is to say, we don't accept the apparent verdict of any word or phrase, i.e., what the word or phrase seems to be saying, but rather we essay into the conditions of the possibility of its truth, or as Kant put it,
the conditions of the possibility of experience in general are likewise conditions of the possibility of the objects of experience.
And to do this, it is essential to view the Quran as itself complete, that is to say, to see it as entirely comprehensible. This is important, as by comprehensible we mean comprehensible in its own terms. When you read a novel or a story of any length, you tend to confide this in the story. You form an unspoken pact with the novel that all of its meanings are to be found within its pages. You may occasionally wander outside the book to a commentary or a literary critique of it to understand some aspect of it, but you know that the information you obtain there in no way replaces or substitutes the experience of directly reading and engaging the text. But even here, the Quran differs, and it's this difference, which not many would consider far-reaching, that shows the philological or hermeneutical facility of the Quran. For all the tools to be in the book, to not require anything outside the book save the language is a huge claim. How is this not contradictory? One may plausibly add, if the very linguisticality of the Quran is itself external or preconditional to its comprehensibility. The answer is that, much like in complex physics equations that explain the mechanics of the physical world, that enable you to phone a friend on the other side of the world, or moreover to do it from the window seat of a plane, which itself is traveling across the world, to understand the speed of sound, of light, to learn about a distant galaxy. We start with simple numbers, natural, whole, rational, irrational, complex, and then build from these a proposition as complex as E equals mc squared, or the Schrödinger equation, which, when broken all the way down, consists in the same elements used to count the number of apples in a fruit stall. The case is likewise in the Quran. Vernacular speech, basic Arabic, is just the critical mass by which to make the sort of leap which number permits with applied sciences and physics. Once enclosed within the sphere of the Quran, the sort of exercise that begins to take shape is purely relational. It becomes a matter of understanding the relation between concepts. In fact, we obtain concepts from the relations between concepts. Much like a word or a verse is formed from the constituency of words or phrases. They are not simply given to us. If given, then they are given in the context of some relation. All ambiguity is an ambiguity of relations. For when it happens that we don't know what a certain word means, what we're really saying is, we don't know the context of the word, that we don't have, in the Kantian sense, the conditions for its possibility. For I see that the word, though ambiguous, is still a system of words, of letters, strung together in a certain way. These letters are not nothing, not things that are meaningless outside the construct of a word or a sentence. They are the same thing which the mathematician or logician calls quantifiers, operators, variables. They are atomic propositions endowed with laws and rules, i.e., ways in which they can be combined and ways in which they can't. They convey operations covering various orders of logic, placeholders for principles that we would call metaphysical, placeholders for universals, for particulars, different forms of the copula, etc. In fact, even as we descend into this fine system of pattern symbolics, as Worf would call them, and study those fine, call them computations, we find that the Quran accounts for them just as rigorously, and it's as important for the studious reader to understand them as closely as any word or sentence or phrase. This condition points to a larger constellation in whose terms alone an ambiguous word can be understood. The assimilation process thus varies in this way. From the ambiguity of the part, we proceed to the whole that subsumes and gives the part its meaning. We do this simply by understanding every context in which a designated word is mentioned. It is strange how words begin to hatch and their meanings slowly emerge when opposed to every instance of their use. For as in Einstein's theory of relativity, the uniformity of the speed of light is gleaned from the relativity of reference frames, the different perspectives from which judgment is cast. Strangely enough, the same methodology applies here, a model whose philological equivalent is found in the Kantian maxim. This is a trick that, once grasped, assures us as to the complete and self-contained nature of the Quran. But again, the proof's in the pudding. One more way of saying that knowledge rests in application. One might think that a word simply means what it means. Why inquire further? And we reply that besides the universe of discourse, let us say, in which a particular word is found, there is a universe of discourse that is exclusive to the word, in which the word is the center. The meaning obtained here of the word is much richer and dynamic, and it's this construct that we're putting together when we're trying to understand a particular word. Take a word like Quran. Meaningful though in itself, most would think, it's an adjective form of the verb read, iqra. Therefore, the Quran means that which is to be recited or read, which is true, but as it turns out, that's merely one of many layers of meaning. The first thing that strikes us is the morphology of the word, the many forms and derivatives of the word. Besides iqra, we find uses that have nothing to do with reading in a familiar sense. Qararan, qariya, qurrat ayn. The word occurs, we see, in embryology, or reproduction, to denote the act of settling or deciding what settles or reposes into the womb, implying a sense of probability as to what could have otherwise occupied the womb. The act of settling, nuqir, gives a final verdict to the exclusion of everything else. It's also used to mean town or community, qarya, to many people's surprise. Now, a lot of people may object to the connection between Quran, Iqra, and Qarya, but it's quite clear that the same inflectional pattern and morphological formula is being followed. Now, it's convenient that for the embryological form, translated as settle, we find an equivalent term, settlement, synonymous with town or village. In fact, the term Qarya extends to all sedentary forms of human settlement. Looking closer, we find that there are conditions that need to be met before settlement could be eligible for the term qarya. Quranically speaking, that is. It needs to be a society, in Arnold J. Toynbee's sense, a complex entity of interconnected, interdependent individuals amongst whom preside transactional relations, trade, education, politics, etc. Associated with the term qarya, the term urush, the plural of arsh, which stands for throne. And throne here, as we've explained before, simply means the economy, the engine that runs a society, around which and for the sake of which governing systems are built. For it is this that enables the society to be transactional, and by extension, the existence of society, i.e., for people to want to depend on each other. Thus, arsh, when pluralized into urush, comes to mean the industries which form the economy. Thus, the expression arsh falls very closely within the universe of discourse of the word qarya. Another word is qararan. This form appears in a cosmological context, which, in consistency with the previous contexts, refers to the earth in one instance and the hereafter in another, as a place of settlement. This is significant, especially in relation to the belief that humans may one day leave the earth for Mars or any other planet. Qararan here eliminates this possibility, for qararan means settlement for real, as in to the avail of no other alternative. Humans will only live and die on earth, and will only live eternally in the hereafter. The last infliction is the expression qurrat ayn, which means the true object of desire, that which is yearned for, that which all the person could ask for. Take the example of Pharaoh's woman, who said of Moses, then a baby whom they found by the riverbank, qurrat ayn, here implying that it's exactly what they'd been wanting, herself and Pharaoh. Now if we inquire as to what these various uses of the word have in common, the answer would be obvious, whether in the reproductive context, the cosmological, or the social sense. The word has a sense of permanence, the kind of permanence that follows a period of flux or change. The embryo is defined in the womb. The earth is our ground only because it is opposed to the sama, the world of change and flux. The earth is the place where things are realized. Thus God uses the expression yelish, which means hypostatized or materialized, to describe how things come to be on the earth, as opposed to the expression yarush, describing the opposite, how things come to alter and change form. In other words, the relation between the universal and the particular. The sama is the realm of form and change, of flow, of continuity. The earth is the realm of discreteness, of shape and definition. Thus, in the rhythm of coming to be and passing into the possibility to be, we can identify yarush as the expression of passage into change, whereas discreteness or definition is the realm of states of definite modes of being. Thus we can think of yelish as those states where definition has taken shape, or materialized, and yarush as those instances in which the shape changes, where something acquires a variable form. Perhaps its capacity to become a part of a genus, or gain universality. This is a definite entering into the realm of continuity, i.e. yelish. Now the opposite of this, where something does take shape and become concretized, is yelush. It's in relation to this that the concept of Quran and its various inflections can be made sense of. Qararan is the permanence that something gains after having been in flux. It is this gaining of a specific final form. Itself being in flux expresses its tendency towards a certain predefined state. We see this with Pharaoh's woman, how she yearned for a child. This yearning is analogous to the flux that precedes concreteness or realization. Also, how from infertility the womb comes to host an embryo. This too expresses flux. Thus, when we speak of the term Quran as an adjective for the expression read, we're referring to the very personification of the object of reading. That is, if there is such a thing as the epitome of readership, a book that satisfies the archetype of reading, that's to reading what moisture is to dryness, what north is to south, then we find this in the Quran. Because in this concept is contained a cosmological component derived from the various contexts of use that justifies this view. This is particularly relevant to the remark we made earlier about the exodus from the humanities towards the natural sciences, being an implication of the search for a field in which our faculties can be allowed to roam free and unhinged. The terms free and unhinged presuppose what we call the very personification of the ultimate object of reading. For if such an impulse exists, then there must be, as Borges put it in the Library of Babel, a book that's the cipher and perfect compendium of all other books. This epitomic expression of an object of reading, or the archetype of reading, i.e. the book, is precisely what the word Quran points to.
Now the letter nun we see at the end of the word Quran is important. As a suffix, it denotes this sense of gaining of concreteness or materiality following the flux of being in different morphological forms. The addition of nun adds being to the concept, finally uniting all the different morphological forms under one compact universe of discourse. This concludes what we meant by these letters having fundamental logical utility. For nun here serves the same function as what's called universal quantification. For all x, where x is the concept of ikra or reading, ppx is true, where pex is the same concept constituting a universe of discourse, i.e., a whole concept. Thanks for watching.